The morning of October 27th, 1944, Torokina Airfield, Bougainville. A Grumman TBM Avenger sits idling on the coral runway, its engine coughing in the humid air. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Commander James Burrell watches a small circular screen mounted to his instrument panel. The image flickers grainy, black and white, barely coherent. Static washes across the glass like rain. 200 yards ahead of him, another aircraft begins its takeoff roll. A simple wooden plane, painted navy blue, its single engine roaring as it accelerates down the strip. Burrell's hand rests on a control stick, but this stick is not connected to his own aircraft. It steers something else. The wooden plane lifts off, its wheels retract, the wings level against the morning sky, and the cockpit visible through the canopy as it climbs is empty. No pilot, no crew, just glass and shadow and the faint glow of instrumentation that no human hand will ever touch. Burrell toggles. The stick. On his screen, the horizon tilts. He corrects. The image steadies. Below, the jungle unfolds in shades of grey, a carpet of trees broken by the occasional scar of a road or the geometric precision of an enemy position. The plane flies toward Rabaul, toward the gun emplacements that have turned that harbour into what American pilots call the graveyard, toward targets that have cost the lives of men who trained for years, died in minutes. This plane carries no such man. It is a TDR-1 torpedo drone raider, Model 1, the world's first operational combat drone, and in 90 seconds it will strike a Japanese ammunition depot with 2,000 pounds of high explosive, guided by television and radio control from a man sitting safely 10 miles away. The Japanese gunners below do not yet understand what they are seeing. They will fire. The plane will not evade. It will not jink or dive. It will fly straight, mechanical, inevitable, like something that cannot be killed, because it was never truly alive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of a weapon that should have changed everything and then vanished. A technology that arrived at the precise moment when its philosophical opposite, the kamikaze, was being born. And the profound irony that while Japan bet its future on human sacrifice, America was quietly proving that sacrifice was optional. To understand what happened in the skies above Bougainville in October of 1944, you must first understand the mathematics of death that brought the TDR-1 into existence. By 1942, the war in the Pacific had calcified into a brutal equation. The Japanese had dug in. From Rabaul to Truk, from the Philippines to the Solomons, they had transformed islands into fortresses, concrete bunkers, artillery positions, and most lethally, anti-aircraft, guns. Hundreds of them. At Rabaul alone, intelligence counted over 300 anti-aircraft pieces ringing the harbour and airfields. American bomber crews called these missions running the gauntlet. The approach was visible for miles. The guns opened up in coordinated barrages. Flak filled the sky like a black fog, and the mathematics were merciless. For every successful strike against a hardened Japanese position, the Navy was losing aircraft at a rate that could not be sustained. But it was not just the aircraft. Aircraft could be replaced. America's industrial capacity in 1942 was already outproducing the entire Axis combined. By mid-war, a new bomber rolled off American production lines every 63 minutes. The problem was the pilots. Training a competent Navy bomber pilot required between 18 and 24 months. Navigation, formation flying, bombing techniques, carrier landings, each skill built slowly, expensively, and when that pilot died over, Rabaul, those 2 years died with him. The Navy could not manufacture experienced aviators the way it manufactured aircraft, so the question became, what if you didn't need the pilot? Commander Delmar S. Farney sat in the Bureau of Aeronautics in Washington, considering this problem. Farney was not a romantic. He did not think in terms of aces or heroism. He thought in terms of systems, inputs, outputs, efficiency. And he had been watching the Navy's radio-controlled target drones with interest. These drones were not weapons. They were flying targets, simple aircraft flown by radio control, used to train anti-aircraft gunners. They were cheap, made mostly of wood and fabric. They were expendable by design. And critically, they were accurate enough. What if you loaded one with bombs? The idea was not entirely new. The Army Air Forces had been experimenting with similar concepts. Operation Aphrodite, which involved packing worn-out B-17 bombers with explosives and guiding them by radio into German targets. But those programs were desperate, improvised, dangerous even to the American crews who launched them. Farney's vision was different, purpose-built, systematic. A drone designed from the beginning to be expendable, guidable, and effective. The proposal landed on desks throughout the Navy hierarchy in late 1942. The reception was mixed. Traditional aviators, men who had built their careers on the romance of flight, resisted. There was something unsporting about it, something that violated the unspoken code of aerial combat. But the numbers spoke louder than tradition. By early 1943, with casualties mounting and strategic bombing campaigns proving costly, the Navy approved the program. The contract went to Interstate Aircraft Corporation in El Segundo, California. The specifications were straightforward. Build a radio-controlled aircraft capable of carrying a 2,000-pound bomb load, guidable from a distance, cheap, enough to be expendable. The designation, TDR-1, Torpedo Drone Raider, Model 1. The resulting aircraft was aggressively utilitarian, wooden airframe, fabric covering. A single Lycoming engine producing 220 horsepower, barely more powerful than a modern automobile. Fixed landing gear, no armor, no defensive guns, no cockpit amenities because there would be no one sitting in the cockpit. The guidance system was an innovation. A television camera, primitive by any standard, mounted in the nose. It transmitted a grainy, low-resolution image back to a control aircraft, typically a TBM Avenger flying several miles behind. The controller watched a small circular screen and steered with a joystick wired into a radio transmitter. The resolution was abysmal. In good conditions, the controller could make out large shapes, coastlines, buildings, ships. In poor conditions, the screen dissolved into static and shadow. The final approach to the target was often guesswork, a combination of dead reckoning and luck. But it was enough. Each TDR-1 cost approximately $3,000 to produce. A human-piloted TBM Avenger cost $54,000. The economic logic was undeniable. You could lose 18 drones for the price of one conventional bomber, and the drones didn't require 2 years of training. By the summer of 1943, production was underway. The Navy ordered an initial batch of 189 aircraft. The plan was to test them in the Pacific Theater, where targets were plentiful and the strategic situation desperate enough to justify experimentation. The unit assigned to operate them, Special Task Air Group 1, redesignated as Stag 1, formed in late 1943. The personnel were an unusual mix. Some were experienced pilots, reassigned from conventional squadrons. Others were radar operators, men accustomed to guiding bombers by reading electronic screens. The task was new. They would not fly and into combat. They would watch combat on a television monitor and steer machines toward their deaths. Training began at Naval Air Station Traverse City, Michigan. The controllers learned to interpret the grainy images, to compensate for lag in the radio signal, to judge distance when depth perception was impossible. They practiced launches and recoveries. They crashed dozens of drones into the forests and lakes of northern Michigan, learning the limits of the technology. Some of them hated it. One pilot, reassigned from fighters, later wrote, "It felt like cheating, like playing a children's game while other men fought." But by September of 1944, Stag-1 was ready. 50 TDR-1 drones, created and packed in Cosmoline, shipped out to the Pacific. Destination, Bougainville, in the Solomon Islands. Mission, to strike Japanese positions around Rabaul, the fortress that had consumed so many American lives. Torokina Airfield was not a base. It was a wound carved into the jungle. A strip of crushed coral, 5,000 feet long, hacked out of the swamp and held by artillery and desperation. The Japanese shelled it regularly. At night, you could hear their guns' distant thunder rolling down from the hills. The ground crews who received the TDR-1 crates in September of 1944 looked at the disassembled drones with something close to disbelief. The aircraft were small, fragile-looking. The wooden frames seemed better suited to hobby shops than combat. One mechanic wrote in a letter home, "They look like model airplanes, the kind kids fly in parks. I don't think they'll last a week." But the specifications told a different story. Wingspan, 48 feet. Length, 34 feet. Weight, 6,000 pounds fully loaded. Operational range, 430 miles. Top speed, 140 miles per hour. And the payload, 2,000 pounds of high explosive, carried in a modified torpedo casing beneath the fuselage. The first test flight occurred on September 27, 1944. The drone launched without incident. The controller, sitting in his TBM Avenger, a safe distance behind, watched the flickering screen as the TDR-1 climbed to altitude. He toggled the stick. The image tilted. He corrected me. The drone leveled. It worked. The technology was crude, barely functional by modern standards, but it worked. The first combat mission launched 1 month later, on October 27th. The target, a cluster of Japanese supply barges and an ammunition depot near Rabaul. 4 TDR-1 drones took off at dawn, each controlled by a separate TBM Avenger flying in loose formation. The Japanese gunners saw them coming. Tracer fire arced up from the positions below. 88mm shells burst in black flowers across the sky. The drones flew through it, not evading, not maneuvering, just flying straight toward impact. 3 hits. 1 malfunctioned, a radio failure or engine trouble. The records are unclear and spiraled into the ocean halfway to the target. 75% success rate. 0 American casualties. The after-action reports were cautious but optimistic. The technology had proven itself under combat conditions. The psychological effect on the Japanese watching pilotless aircraft fly into their positions was noted but not fully understood. Because at that exact moment, 200 miles away, the Japanese Navy was formalizing a doctrine built on the opposite principle. October 25, 1944. The Philippines. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi stood before a group of young pilots and explained to them how they were going to die. The situation was desperate. The American advance across the Pacific had been relentless. Island after island had fallen. The Japanese Navy, once dominant, had been shattered at the Philippine Sea. Conventional tactics, dogfights, torpedo runs, level bombing had failed. What remained was a single, terrible option: turn the pilot into the guidance system. The concept was not new. Individual acts of self-sacrifice had occurred throughout the war: damaged planes diving into enemy ships, pilots choosing death over capture. But Onishi was proposing something systematic: organized suicide as military doctrine. He called them Tokubetsu Kogekitai Special Attack Units. The name was formal, bureaucratic, but everyone knew the colloquial term kamikaze, divine wind, named after the typhoon that had once saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century. The logic was brutal, but internally coherent. A conventional bomb, dropped from altitude, had perhaps a 5% chance of hitting a moving ship, but a plane piloted directly into the target, guided by human eyes, corrected in real time, committed to impact, was nearly unstoppable. The pilot became a living guidance computer, more accurate than any technology Japan could produce. And Japan had pilots. Young men, raised on stories of samurai and bushido, the way of the warrior, taught that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor, indoctrinated through years of militaristic education to view self-sacrifice not as tragedy but as transcendence. Onishi's speech to those first kamikaze pilots is recorded in multiple sources. He did not appeal to military strategy. He appealed to their souls. Japan faces a crisis, he told them. Our conventional forces cannot turn the tide, but you individually, through your spirit and your willingness to sacrifice, can achieve what entire fleets cannot. Your deaths will have meaning. They will inspire the nation. They will prove that the American material advantage means nothing against Japanese spiritual strength. The pilots volunteered. Not all of them. Some later accounts reveal coercion, social pressure impossible to resist, but many genuinely believed. They wrote farewell letters. They participated in ceremonies. They tied hachimaki, headbands, around their foreheads, emblazoned with the rising sun. And then they flew planes loaded with explosives directly into American ships. The first organized kamikaze attacks occurred on October 25, 1944, 2 days before the TDR-1's first combat mission. 5 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters dove into the American escort carriers off Samar. The USS Street Low sank. The USS Santee and USS Swanee were heavily damaged. The tactic was horrific. It was also effective. Over the following months, kamikaze attacks sank 34 American ships and damaged over 300 more. The psychological impact on American sailors was profound. You could shoot down a conventional bomber and it would retreat or fall into the sea, but a kamikaze, even burning, even missing a wing, would keep coming. The pilot's death was not a deterrent. It was a weapon. The Japanese propagandists celebrated them. Posters showed young pilots ascending to heaven. Newspapers printed their final letters. The attacks were framed as proof of Japanese spiritual superiority, that while America had factories and steel, Japan had something more powerful: men willing to die. But there was a problem with this philosophy. You could not scale it. A kamikaze pilot required months of training, less than a fully trained aviator, but still significant. And every successful attack consumed not just the aircraft but the pilot, irreversibly, permanently. By early 1945, Japan was running out of pilots. Not just experienced ones, those had been gone for years, but any pilots at all. The training programs were graduating teenagers with barely 40 hours of flight time. Some kamikaze pilots in the final months of the war could barely take off and land. They were pointed at the target and told to fly straight. The industrial mathematics were equally brutal. Each kamikaze required an aircraft, a Zero, a bomber, whatever could be spared from a shrinking production capacity. And unlike the Americans, Japan could not replace losses. The factories were being bombed. The raw materials were running out. The fuel situation was catastrophic. By contrast, the TDR-1 program was designed for attrition. After the October 27th mission, Stag-1 flew more. November brought a dozen strikes. December, 2 dozen. The targets were varied: fuel depots, radar installations, bridges, supply dumps. The success rate fluctuated. Some missions saw 80% hits, others barely 30%. But the losses were acceptable because the losses were not human. When a TDR-1 went down, the controller simply launched another. The drone was $3,000, and some would. The kamikaze was a human life and years of training. But the American High Command was not thinking in those terms. Not yet. Because by early 1945, something strange was happening to the TDR-1 program. Despite its success, despite the proven effectiveness of the technology, it was being quietly dismantled. The reasons were complex, political, and cultural. But they revealed something profound about the American relationship with warfare, sacrifice, and what it meant to be a warrior. And that is where the irony becomes total. The problem began not with technology, but with men. By January of 1945, the TDR-1 had flown over 50 combat missions. The statistics were clear. Success rates averaged between 55% and 65%, extraordinary for any guided weapon in that era. A conventional bombing run against a fortified target might achieve 20% accuracy on a good day. The drones were hitting targets at triple that rate, with 0 pilot casualties. But inside the Navy's aviation community, resentment was building. Naval aviation in 1945 was not just a military branch. It was a culture built on individual heroism, on the mythology of the ace, on the idea that combat was fundamentally a test of personal skill and courage. The entire structure of promotion, prestige, and identity revolved around pilots who flew into danger and returned. The TDR-1 violated that mythology. The controllers sat miles away from the target, watching grainy screens, steering with joysticks. They faced no flak. They made no split-second decisions under fire. When the mission ended, they flew home safely, always. There was no danger, no test, no proof of courage. And the regular pilots, the men still flying conventional bombers into Japanese gun emplacements, began to ask uncomfortable questions. One pilot, in a letter preserved in naval archives, wrote, "If this is the future, then what are we? What does it mean to be a naval aviator if the war can be fought by technicians watching televisions?" The resistance was subtle at first. Reports from the field began emphasizing the TDR-1's failures rather than its successes. When a drone malfunctioned, and they did, frequently the incidents were undocumented in detail. When missions succeeded, the language was cautious, hedged, reluctant to declare triumph. By February of 1945, senior officers were raising concerns. Not about effectiveness the TDR-1 worked, but about culture, about what would happen to naval aviation if remote warfare became the norm. A memo from Rear Admiral Calvin T. Durgin, dated February 14, 1945, makes the argument explicit. While the TDR program has demonstrated tactical utility, there is concern that over-reliance on remote weapons systems may erode the warrior ethos essential to naval aviation. The skills required to pilot an aircraft under combat conditions, judgment under fire, courage in the face of danger, are not developed by controlling drones from a distance. If we pursue this technology too aggressively, We risk producing a generation of aviators who are technically proficient but spiritually unprepared for the realities of combat. Warrior ethos, spiritual preparation. The language was almost identical to what the Japanese were saying about the kamikaze. But there were practical considerations as well. By early 1945, the strategic situation in the Pacific had shifted. The island-hopping campaign was succeeding. The Philippines had been liberated. Iwo Jima and Okinawa were next massive operations that would require overwhelming conventional force. The heavily fortified positions that had justified the TDR-1's development were either captured or bypassed. Rabaul, once the centerpiece of Japanese defense in the South Pacific, had been isolated and neutralized without invasion. The targets that remained were either too dispersed for drone strikes or important enough to require manned bombers with human judgment. And then there was the technological reality. The TDR-1 was crude, the television guidance was unreliable in bad weather, useless at night, easily disrupted by interference. The radio control had limited range. The controller had to stay within line of sight, which meant flying dangerously close to enemy positions, and the drones themselves were fragile, wooden airframes, no redundancy. A single hit from anti-aircraft fire usually meant total loss. The kamikazes, for all their horrific cost, had one advantage. They were adaptable. A human pilot could adjust to changing conditions, evade unexpected threats, choose alternate targets if the primary was obscured. The TDR-1 could only fly where it was steered, see what the camera saw, and hit what was directly ahead. But these were rationalizations, useful, technically accurate, but not the real reason. The real reason was that the TDR-1 made people uncomfortable. It made war too easy, too distant, too much like a factory process, inputs and outputs, costs and returns. It removed the human element that made warfare comprehensible, that allowed people to understand it as a contest between men rather than a mechanical slaughter, managed by technicians. In March of 1945, the Navy quietly cancelled further TDR-1 production. The official reason given was operational priorities. The unofficial reason was never written down, but it permeated the decision. The technology worked too well, and that was precisely the problem. The remaining drones flew a few more missions. Some were cannibalized for parts. Others were used as target practice, an ironic fate for aircraft designed to be targets themselves. A handful were pushed off carrier decks into the Pacific, disappearing without ceremony into the water. Stag 1 was disbanded. The controllers were reassigned to conventional squadrons, back into cockpits, back into aircraft where they could die. The technology did not disappear, of course. The research was classified and filed away. Engineers kept the designs. The concept of television-guided remote weapons remained in development, quietly, away from the cultural battlefield of naval aviation, politics. But for the moment, in the spring of 1945, the future of warfare retreated. The Navy returned to what it understood: men in planes, flying into danger, proving their courage through risk. And 2,000 miles away, the Japanese were learning that courage was not enough. April 6, 1945. Off the coast of Okinawa, the largest kamikaze attack of the war begins at dawn. Over 300 aircraft fighters, bombers, anything that could carry explosives launch from airfields across Kyushu. They fly south in loose formations, heading for the American invasion fleet. Operation Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums. The name is poetic, beautiful. The reality is not. The American radar picks them up 100 miles out. Combat air patrols intercept. Dozens of kamikazes are shot down before reaching the fleet, but dozens more get through. They dive. Some aim for the big carriers, others go for destroyers on picket duty, the ships stationed far from the main fleet to provide early warning. The destroyers cannot retreat. Their job is to stand and absorb the attacks, to buy time for the fleet behind them. The USS Bush is hit by 3 kamikazes in 40 minutes. It sinks. The USS Colquhoun is hit by 4. It sinks. The USS Emmons takes 5 direct hits and has to be scuttled by American gunfire because it will not go down on its own. 87 Americans died that day on the picket line alone. Over 300 are wounded. The psychological toll is worse than the physical. One sailor, in a letter written days later, describes watching a burning kamikaze dive toward his ship. You shoot. You see pieces fly off. You see fire. But it keeps coming. The pilot is already dead, but he's still flying, still guiding, still aiming. You realize you're not fighting a man. You're fighting a ghost that's been trained to want to die. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The kamikaze attacks continue for weeks. Operation Kikusui runs through 10 major waves. From April through June of 1945, nearly 2,000 suicide aircraft are launched. They sank over 30 ships. They damage 300 more. They kill nearly 5,000 American sailors. The numbers are staggering. By any conventional measure, the kamikaze tactic is devastating. But by the metric that matters changing the outcome of the war, it fails completely. Because the Americans keep coming. For every ship sunk, 10 more arrive. For every sailor killed, 100 more are trained. The industrial advantage that the kamikaze was meant to overcome simply absorbs the losses and continues. The Japanese, meanwhile, are running out of everything. By May of 1945, the kamikaze training programs are graduating pilots with 20 hours of flight time. Some have never landed on a carrier, some have never flown at night. They are taught to take off, fly straight, and die. The aircraft are worse. Early kamikazes flew Zeros, excellent fighters, highly maneuverable. By late 1945, they were flying training planes, obsolete bombers, anything with an engine. Some are loaded with improvised explosives, artillery shells wired together, fuel drums packed with gunpowder. The fuel situation is catastrophic. Japan is importing almost no oil. The synthetic fuel programs cannot meet demand. Kamikaze missions are allocated just enough fuel for a one-way trip, and even that is rationed carefully. And the pilots know. By the final months of the war, there is no illusion. The farewell ceremonies continue, the headbands, the sake, the final photographs, but the tone has shifted. Early kamikaze pilots wrote letters filled with idealism, with belief in divine mission. Later letters are different. They speak of duty, of resignation, of dying because there is no other choice. One pilot, in a letter discovered after the war, wrote, "I do not believe this will change the outcome, but I will go anyway, because to refuse would dishonor my family. This is what we have become, a nation that eats its children to delay the inevitable. The strategy consumes itself." By August of 1945, Japan had lost over 4,000 pilots to kamikaze attacks. 4,000 men who will never train another pilot, never design another aircraft, never rebuild the nation. And the Americans? They adapt, they develop new radar systems, they improve combat air patrol tactics, they station destroyers in rings around the main fleet, sacrificing the small ships to protect the large. They accept the losses and continue, because the fundamental equation never changes. America can afford to lose, Japan cannot. August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. The Enola Gay drops a single bomb. 16 kilotons. 66,000 people die instantly. Another 70,000 will die from radiation over the following months. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Another bomb. 40,000 died instantly. 60,000 more from radiation. The kamikazes have sunk 34 ships. The atomic bombs erase 2 cities. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio. His voice, most Japanese have never heard it before, is thin, formal, archaic. He does not say, surrender. The language is more oblique. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The kamikazes are over. The divine wind has failed. And somewhere in a warehouse in California, a stack of TDR-1 drones sits in crates, forgotten, already obsolete, already vindicated. The irony completes itself slowly, over decades. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the TDR-1 is a footnote. Military historians focus on the big battles Midway, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The kamikazes are remembered because they are dramatic, because they embody the stereotype of fanatical Japanese resistance. The drones are forgotten because they are boring, because they represent nothing romantic. But the technology does not die. The Navy's research into guided missiles continues. The TDR-1's television guidance system is refined. The radio control architecture is improved. By the 1950s, new programs emerged more sophisticated, more capable, but fundamentally the same concept. Unmanned aircraft, guided remotely, designed to strike targets without risking pilots. The terminology changes. Drone becomes UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle, then RPA, remotely piloted aircraft. The euphemisms multiply as the technology spreads. By the 1960s, the Air Force was flying drones over Vietnam reconnaissance missions, too dangerous for manned aircraft. By the 1980s, the Navy was testing armed drones. By the 1990s, Predators were flying over Bosnia. And then comes September 11th, 2001. The global war on terror accelerates drone development by decades. The Predator becomes the Reaper, armed with Hellfire missiles, capable of loitering over targets for hours, controlled by pilots sitting in air-conditioned trailers in Nevada, watching high-definition video feeds, striking targets in Afghanistan or Yemen or Somalia with the press of a button. By 2025, the United States military operates over 11,000 drones. The technology that the Navy cancelled in 1945 because it eroded warrior ethos is now the primary tool of American warfare. The cultural objections have not disappeared. They have simply been overridden by pragmatism. Drones work. They keep American pilots safe. They are cheaper than manned aircraft. They can fly longer, loiter over targets, strike with precision that human pilots cannot match. And the ethical questions, the questions about what it means to wage war from a distance, about whether courage matters if there is no risk, about the psychological cost of killing by remote control, those questions are still unresolved. The drone operators, they are called pilots now, officially suffer from PTSD at rates comparable to combat infantry. They watch their targets in high definition. They see the strikes in real time. They fly missions for 12 hours and then drive home to dinner with their families. The distance does not make it easier. It makes it stranger. The Japanese kamikaze program killed nearly 7,000 American sailors and sank 34 ships. The TDR-1 program flew approximately 50 combat missions and killed an unknown number of Japanese soldiers. The records are incomplete. the targets often dispersed. By pure body count, the kamikaze was more effective. But by every other metric, the TDR-1 represented the future. Because the kamikaze was a strategy of desperation, it required a specific cultural moment, a population indoctrinated to view self-sacrifice as the highest virtue, a military willing to systematically consume its own personnel, a government desperate enough to embrace tactics that could never scale. You cannot build an empire on kamikaze attacks. You can only delay collapse. But you can build an empire on drones. The United States in 2025 operates drones on every continent. They fly missions over declared war zones and undeclared ones. They strike terrorists and wedding parties and sometimes cannot tell the difference until after the explosion. They are cost-effective, politically convenient, and strategically flexible. They are the TDR-1's descendants, refined over 80 years of continuous development, and the philosophy that created them, that the pilot is optional, that war can be waged by technicians watching screens, that sacrifice is waste rather than virtue, has become dominant not through moral argument, but through simple effectiveness. The Japanese believed the pilot's willingness to die made him more effective. The Americans proved that removing the pilot made the weapon more effective. Both philosophies worked in the short term, only one scale. There is a photograph in the National Archives, black and white, undated, but probably from late 1944. It shows a TDR-1 on the deck of a carrier. The deck crew is positioning it for launch. You can see the wooden airframe, the fabric covering, the television camera mounted in the nose like a single eye, and visible through the canopy, the empty cockpit. No seat, no instruments for human hands. Just wiring and radio equipment, and the mechanical guts of something that never needed to be alive. The photograph is labeled Assault Drone, Pacific Theater. No other information, no names of the crew. No indication of whether this particular drone ever flew a mission or was lost at sea or survived the war. It is anonymous, unmemorable, exactly what it was designed to be. The kamikazes have memorials. There is a museum at Chiran, in southern Japan, dedicated to the special attack units. It displays their letters, their photographs, their personal effects. Thousands of people visit each year. The pilots are honored as tragic heroes, victims of a desperate time. The TDR-1 has no memorial. There is no museum. The aircraft that survived were scrapped for parts or left to rot in warehouses. The controllers who flew them did not receive medals for their missions because the missions were classified, unremarkable, successful but not heroic. And yet the TDR-1 changed warfare more profoundly than the kamikaze ever could, because the kamikaze had an ending, the final expression of a philosophy that had run out of options. The divine wind that revealed itself to be just wind, powerful in the moment, gone without trace. The TDR-1 was a beginning, the first step toward a future where war is conducted by machines guided by humans who never leave the ground, where sacrifice is unnecessary because presence is unnecessary, where the warrior becomes obsolete because the warrior was never the weapon, just the guidance system, and guidance systems can be mechanized. In October of 1944, two philosophies collided over the Pacific. One said, "The human is the weapon. Train him to die willingly. Celebrate his sacrifice. Build a culture that makes suicide a virtue." The other said, "Humans are expensive. Keep him safe. Make the machine expendable. Sacrifice nothing irreplaceable." Both philosophies killed efficiently. Both were tested in combat. Both worked within their contexts. But only one could survive contact with the 21st century. The kamikaze required a specific cultural moment, militaristic indoctrination, authoritarian control, a population willing to die for abstract concepts like honor and nation. That moment passed. It cannot be recreated. Even modern terrorist suicide bombers, often compared to kamikazes, operate on different logic: religious martyrdom, political desperation, individual fanaticism, not systematic military doctrine. The drone required only technology and pragmatism, and technology improves. Pragmatism is universal. By 2025, every major military power operates armed drones. China has the Wing Lung, Israel has the Hermes, Iran has the Shahed, Russia uses drones extensively in Ukraine. Turkey exports drones to 20 countries. Technology has democratized. The barrier to entry, once restricted to superpowers with advanced electronics and satellite networks, has collapsed. You can build a functional attack drone with off-the-shelf components and a smartphone. The kamikaze, meanwhile, remains a historical curiosity, a cautionary tale about what happens when desperation becomes doctrine. No modern military would consider implementing systematic suicide tactics, not because they are morally objectionable, though they are, but because they are inefficient. You cannot scale self-destruction. But you can scale automation. Lieutenant Commander James Burrell, the TDR-1 controller who flew the first combat mission in October of 1944, survived the war. He returned to the United States, transitioned to commercial aviation, and flew passenger aircraft for United Airlines for 23 years. He rarely spoke about his time with Stag 1. In an interview conducted in 1981, late in his life, he was asked if he thought the TDR-1 program had been a success. His answer, preserved in an oral history archive at the Naval History and Heritage Command, is worth quoting in full. "We proved it worked. That's what we were supposed to do. Whether it was a success depends on what you think success means. We hit targets. We didn't lose pilots. From a tactical standpoint, yes, it was successful. But I think the Navy wasn't ready for what it meant. We weren't ready. The idea that you could fight a war without risking yourself, it made people uncomfortable. Still does, I imagine. I don't know if that discomfort is justified or just sentiment, but I do know that what we did in 1944 is what everyone does now. We were just early." He died in 1986, 3 years before the Predator drone flew its first test flight. The Japanese kamikaze pilots left thousands of letters. Many are preserved in museums and archives. They are haunting documents, expressions of duty, fear, resignation, occasional genuine belief. Some pilots wrote poetry, some wrote apologies to their parents, some wrote nothing at all. One letter, written by Second Lieutenant Ichizo Hayashi the night before his final mission, April 10, 1945, contains these lines: "I do not hate the enemy. I do not believe my death will save Japan, but I will go because to refuse is impossible. I have been taught that life without honor is meaningless. Perhaps that teaching was a lie, but it is too late to unlearn it. Tomorrow I will fly into an American ship, and that will be the end. I hope my death troubles someone. I hope it makes them ask if this was necessary. I hope, but hope is also useless now." Hayashi's plane was shot down before reaching the fleet. His body was never recovered. His letter survived because he gave it to a friend who did not fly that day, who surrendered in August, who kept the letter for 40 years before donating it to a museum. It is one of thousands. Expressions of individual humanity caught in a system that treated humanity as ammunition. The TDR-1 operators left almost no personal accounts. The missions were classified. The technology was secret. The work was unglamorous. There are no poetic letters, no farewell ceremonies, no cultural memory, just after-action reports, technical assessments, statistics. 50-plus missions were flown. Success rate, 55 to 65%. American casualties, 0. The difference is absolute. One philosophy demanded that human beings become memorable through 5. Sacrifice. The other demanded that they become forgettable through safety. One produced poetry, the other produced data. And in the end, data won. There is no moral to this story because history does not provide morals. It provides outcomes. The outcome is this. In 2025, warfare is increasingly automated. Drones fly missions that would have required pilots in 1945. Artificial intelligence assists targeting decisions. Remote operators control weapons from continents away. The technology that the US Navy rejected in 1945 for eroding warrior ethos is now integral to American military doctrine. The warrior ethos, the idea that combat requires physical courage, personal risk, presence on the battlefield has not disappeared, but it has been supplemented, sometimes replaced, by a different ethos, effectiveness without exposure. The Japanese kamikaze program, built on the opposite philosophy, killed thousands, but changed nothing. It was a spectacular failure dressed in the language of honor. The TDR-1 program, cancelled despite its success, became the template for modern warfare, and the irony, the deep, structural irony that runs through this entire story, is that both sides were wrong about what mattered. The Japanese thought sacrifice made warriors effective. It didn't. It made them dead. The Americans thought removing risk would erode warrior culture. It didn't. It just changed what warrior meant. What neither side fully understood in 1944 was that the future of warfare would not be decided by philosophy. It would be decided by scalability, by cost-effectiveness, by the cold mathematics of what could be sustained and what could not. The kamikaze could not be sustained. 4,000 pilots died, an entire generation consumed. A nation's future burned as fuel for a strategy that delayed defeat by months. The drone could be sustained, could be improved, could be mass-produced, could be operated by people who went home at night. One philosophy led to Hiroshima, the other led to the 21st century, and we are still living in the consequences of both. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.